that. I'll be posting the video later today. But yeah, I guess one thing I, as an introduction to Stirner, the I think the key thing to say about Stirner is that he has had a very interesting influence on modern continental philosophy. Um, Gilles Deleuze wrote about him, Foucault wrote about him, Camus wrote about him, and there are a variety of other continental philosophers, mostly within the French tradition, although there are some in the German um, that that look to Stirner either with great approval, with um, and or great disgust, and much of this I feel comes from the publishing of the manuscript that Karl Marx never published in his lifetime, the German ideology. I believe that came out in the early 90s. And so this had a delayed reaction in the intellectual world and what Karl Marx thought. And Karl Marx was within the same type of sphere that Max Stirner was in, known as the left Hegelians, although Marx would later distance himself from this. The left Hegelians are a response to Hegel. And so this is where I see, to understand Stirner, at least in my opinion, it is important to understand his historical context. I do think it's I do think you can read Stirner without the historical context. I think, however, it is more you have a more rich and deep and nuanced understanding of Stirner if you do have an understanding of his historical context and the philosophical context that he is within. Max Stirner is responding to Hegel along with all the other left Hegelians. During this time period, it is the early to mid 1800s, and this is where during this time Germany is in I think Germany is not yet in a constitutional monarchy. I believe France has already gone through one republic, through the French Revolution, and then we have Napoleon, and I believe Napoleon. I forget when Napoleon dies, but the French Revolution and Napoleon is a key moment in European history, and the reaction that occurs to Napoleon and France for being this very progressive, as I'm going to label it, a country, for embracing a republic. Doing away with the king, doing away with the church. That's anarchy. And so this is where there would be a reaction from Spain, from Germany, from Austria. It wasn't really Germany then. It was Austria, Prussia, and various other countries that would try to squash this republic. And so they all had monarchies. They all had absolute monarchies. And so this reaction to France would be something that would divide political opinions during the time. And you were either very in favor of the revolution, or and causing a mess in the streets and destroying their own communities, and so on and so on, or you're very much against it. And this is where we have Hegel, who would be very much inspired by Napoleon, seeing him as a figure that embodies the world spirit, that unites the people in a progressive movement towards the future. This is where, and Hegel becomes a key moment in Germany, and in response to the Kantian transcendental idealism, in which the key, I think the key takeaway, at least perhaps from a theological perspective, is that in some sense Hegel says that we can understand God, that we can have not only can we understand God, but that we can know God, and in some sense we are God, and it is through mutual recognition and the and interdependence in and through each other, through institutions, through family structures, through greater universalizing projects, that we can come to understand spirit and the absolute spirit that underlies all. And so in this sense, this is where Hegel becomes, during this time, he is promoted and moves to the College of Jena, I believe. In either case, Hegel becomes extremely popular, and he is also an extremely divisive figure. the those who subscribe to Hegel would be called the old Hegelians, the right Hegelians. These would be people who would be for the crown, for the church, and for um, the state. And these would be people who would be more contemporary to Hegel, more his age, whereas the younger Hegelians would be known as the more progressive and therefore the more left Hegelians, and these people would be those who are against the state, against the crown, against the church. And so this is where um, and the and this can be found because in one sense Hegel finds revolution to be something um, incredibly important to the progression of history, very much inspired by the revolution, very much even during that time he was doing all the gestures and symbols that were supportive. He planted a freedom tree, a liberty tree, which was in support of the French Revolution, seeking to bring greater freedom or liberty to the public, the republic. And so Hegel, on one hand, very much supports revolution and is very much in favor of progress. However, on the other hand, he's also very much in favor of tradition, in favor of, as we said, authority. And so there's this dividing tension of what do we do with Hegel, especially after he dies in, I believe, the 1830s. And this tension would be something that would first percolate in a few writers, seeing Hegel as bringing a potential atheism that could destroy, well, not just an atheism, I should say, um, a particular radical and revolutionary force that undoes the positions of the right and the old Hegelians, those who are in favor of the state, the church, and the monarchy. And so here, the left Hegelians would seek to push Hegel, the view of Hegel, into one who is, as Bruno Bauer would write, the Antichrist, or as an atheist, or as someone who is a pantheist, like an atheist pantheist, like Spinoza. And so very much trying to align Hegel into their own positions. This is where Stirner finds himself within. And many of these figures on the left, Hegelians, would find themselves ostracized and pushed away from economic opportunities, from employment. Bruno Bauer, for example, was a teacher at a college, and because he was suspected as an atheist, and he was an atheist, he was fired, and his brother, who was aiming to do the same thing, understood that he would never be able to have employment, and he would find employment through journaling. And so we have a variety of very previously religious and Christian people who read Hegel, who used Hegel and saw how Hegel moved beyond Christianity into something new. And this is where Feuerbach comes in, where Feuerbach sees a new philosophy of the future, humanism, a new religion of the future, rather than Christianity, which divides people and separates people. Feuerbach puts forward the idea that we can have a universal religion where everyone where everyone sees each other as man to man, as a fraternity, as siblings. And we have and there's various divisions within this. Keep in mind, this is not a unified position. These are not unified positions within the young Hegelians, but generally it can be divided that there are two leading members within the young Hegelians. We have Bruno Bauer, who is in favor of the method of Hegel's reasoning, which he saw as critique or criticism, that through the refining fires of criticism, we can do away with the negative, how do I say, the negative and in the negative, we can do away with I'm forgetting the word, the harmful ideas of Christianity and move towards something that is more fulfilling. Whereas, as I've mentioned with Feuerbach, he wants to move towards something that is, a grand vision for the new philosophy of the future, a new religion that unifies humanity. And Stirner would find himself more aligned with underneath Bruno Bauer, that through criticism, we can refine our ideas and come to something that is more aligned with the word I'm going to use is with life. Although that's probably a contentious statement to make. In either case, Stirner finds himself in the most radical groups of his time in Prussia, in Berlin, and and this is where Karl Marx, who was very much influenced by Feuerbach, would pick up his journaling and editing career with through what's it called, man, I'm forgetting the word. It's the Rheinische Zeitung. And and I think, is it the Neue Rheinische Zeitung? In either case, the paper is called I forget what it's called in English. In either case, Stirner would also the how do I say, the journal that Karl Marx would take up on editing. Stirner would publish to that very same article. However, Karl Marx would take editorship after it, but by just a few months after Stirner had written all his articles for the Rheinische Zeitung. And so there's this interesting connection and cross, how do I say, and how do I say, Stirner is in these circles, and we can see even in Karl Marx how Stirner influenced Karl Marx, perhaps for better or worse. And so Stirner has had, as I'm going to say, a wide impact on modern philosophy, not just through Karl Marx. Karl Marx would respond to Stirner in the German ideology, but even in Das Kapital, we can see hints that Karl Marx is still, which was like I think 40 years later, much published much later than the German ideology was written. The Karl Marx still is thinking of Stirner and grappling with Stirner. One way we can see how Stirner influenced Engels, for example, is that Engels was very much in favor of, he had this type of moralism about him where capitalism was evil because it relied upon people's greed. But Stirner points out that it is through selfishness, it is through greed that we aspire to something better for ourselves, perhaps towards a newer world, perhaps towards communism. And this is where Friedrich Engels, having read Stirner, would positively write to Karl Marx saying, Stirner has a lot to say here. If only he would recognize that what he's saying here would lead towards communism. And so afterwards, Friedrich Engels would drop his moralizing about greed. No doubt, he probably still has those sentiments. He's still very much against capitalism, but he approaches it from less of a moralistic angle. And so Stirner would be this unlucky penny that follows philosophy everywhere. And in this, we can see, how do I say, and with this unlucky penny, the question is why is Stirner constantly this tertiary figure of philosophy, and yet many of the most prominent and most well-known philosophers of today have read him, and as I said, and positively and see him as a positive, or see him as an absolute negative. The question here is for us to discuss, and as I've said, since Stirner has influenced a great deal of philosophy, particularly he finds himself resonant with existentialism. I like to compare him to Kierkegaard, but he's just the anti-theist version of Kierkegaard. He's not Christian. Or other people would read Nietzsche and see him as a plagiarist, and see Nietzsche as a plagiarist of Stirner, which I don't think is culpable. I don't think that is. I can see the resemblance, but I don't think Nietzsche was a plagiarist. In either case, Stirner would also influence Bataille, who would influence Lacan, perhaps minorly, but I do think there's a connection there. Either case, there's a great deal that can be said about Stirner, and there's a great deal that Stirner has to say about our modern condition. Even though he was written in the 19th century, many of the topics that Stirner discusses are still relevant to us today. The questions of Christianity, the questions of political organization, the questions of ideology, the questions of alienation and what to do with it. Stirner, I would argue, is one that's, although he may be an unlucky penny, this unlucky penny has followed us into our modern day, and still finds himself influencing thinkers that have and do grapple and address the topics of today in a very interesting way. And so I think to read Stirner is one in which how do I say it, it's a very I'm not going to continue anymore, but that's kind of my general introduction to Stirner. Um, we're 15. Yeah. Do we have any questions about this introduction? I'm if not, I'm going to be moving on to our reading, but I'm happy to you know, pick out the weeds and split hairs on certain topics here on this general introduction to Stirner and to his history and anything at all. Well, I'm happy for anyone to interrupt me at any time. Feel free to comment in the meeting chat or the Discord. I will see things in the meeting chat sooner than um, than otherwise. However, uh, yeah, please feel free to interrupt me at any moment because I'm always happy to hear this discussion or conversation. Let me share. Um, is it? Yeah, I'm gonna do the whole of my screen here. So pardon me here. Um, let me pull up the meeting here, and yeah, yep, here we are. So it might seem that we're on page 63 of the book. However, there's an introductory essay by Jason McQuinn, which is about 50 pages long. It's about a third of the whole book. But if you go, I think the book starts, yeah, right here on page 53. So we're not that far into it. We're about 10 pages in. You're more than welcome to read beforehand or to catch up with us. But as I said, that you don't have to do that. The one thing I should say about Stirner's critics, however, is that during this time censorship was very high. It was, and this is coming right before. This was published in 1845, I believe, and this was 3 years before the March revolutions that would spread like a fire from oh man, I'm forgetting, oh across Europe. This would happen in Italy, would happen in France, would happen in Prussia, would happen in Budapest, and various other major cities in Europe, seeking to undo the monarchies and institute um, something better for the public. For some places that could be a constitutional monarchy, others an absolute monarchy. Sorry, others a republic in opposition to the absolute monarchy. But this this these revolutions uh, would be the attempt of the people to seek something better for themselves. And it is from the 1848 revolution that um, that Prussia comes for the first time to become a constitutional monarchy rather than an absolute monarchy. And so these are times of political contention, political discontent, and political division. This is and because of this, because of the many radical voices that are calling for change, censorship is on the rise. Much of the papers and presses that Stirner would publish to and would be censored, and much of the things Stirner would write would also be censored. One of and because of this, many of the things that people would write, particularly reviews in these editorials, would be in the third person, and would be semi-anonymous. Stirner, for example, I think would go under the pseudonym of Edmund Gans, I think, or sometimes just E. But Stirner here is speaking in third person. But for those who know his pseudonym, they know that this is Stirner himself speaking. And so if Stirner is speaking in the third person, we can understand that this is Stirner just avoiding censorship. This is Stirner avoiding censorship for himself, and this is also a means of. Yeah, I think I will leave it there. In either case, the three things I want to point out is that there are three critiques of Stirner that he brings up here. Two are in English. Only one I have found. The last one is Scelzia, which is in German. I haven't been able to find an English translation of this. We have Moses' Hess here, and then Ludwig Feuerbach's, but not Scelzia. The critiques here, these three critiques of Stirner's magnum opus, The Uniqueness Property, come from a variety of different positions. Scelzia likely worked with Bruno Bauer, and so we're going to be addressing how Bruno Bauer and his colleagues would respond to Stirner. We're going to have Feuerbach's response to Stirner. And then we have Moses Hess, who is a colleague of Karl Marx, a socialist at the time. And so it is through him that we can possibly see the closest thing to a critique Karl Marx would have for Max Stirner's work, The Uniqueness Property. In this how do I say, response that Stirner gives, he seeks to clarify the things that are most misunderstood in his work. I think the principal one that he first addresses is what egoism is, or perhaps, sorry, I'm mistaken, what the unique is. And this is a difficult thing for Stirner, because the goal of Stirner's project is to move away from the universalizing concepts that seek to determine individuals, that seek to determine thoughts, and these particular concepts, these particular ideas, he sees as, in today's terms, we could call ideology. They frame, they fix, and they enclose people within a certain mode of thinking and being and doing. To Stirner, he wants to move away from these things, and he sees within the radical atheists of the day, in Bruno Bauer and Feuerbach especially, he sees within them the highest piety, and the greatest theodicies that they're writing. Feuerbach speaks of the human being, and he says we all are human beings, but with this universal generalization and a description of what we are, he seeks to make moral and prescriptive claims on what humans ought to be. Stirner, in respect to this, is at has great disgust for this idea, because if I'm understood to be human, then why must I, if I understand myself to be first and foremost human, then why must I live up to being the human being? And this is where Feuerbach comes in, and all he does is replace the Christian God with the human God. And so here we can see Stirner as not just rejecting the, how do I say, is not just an anti-theist in respect to religion. He's an anti-theist in respect to the quote unquote secular ideas of his time. He sees within the human idea, the human ideal that Feuerbach puts up as a new God that demands fealty and demands, I would say, moral scrupulosity. And Stirner wishes to do away with all of this. And so rather than seeking to live up to a universal concept, and there are many examples of these, one example he gives is masculinity, femininity, the human, as already mentioned, and there are also the other concepts that one can find fixed to their identity, such as the Christian, religious identities. But then there's also political identities: the socialist, the liberal, I'm forgetting a couple others. In either case, Stirner would have a great, people would find a great interest in Stirner, particularly those deconstructing gender norms in the early 1900s. Stirner would be influential towards a few individuals working in the Institute of Sexual Wissenschaft in Germany, which the Nazis would later burn the books therefrom. Stirner would also find great interest to those who are feminists. Emma Goldman is another one who would be inspired by not just Stirner, but also Nietzsche. And so with Stirner's unique, it is this concept, it is this non-concept that deconstructs the limits of what is taken to be necessary or absolute. It is this thing that seeks to undermine and deconstruct that which is deemed to be immovable and absolutely fixed. The unique for Stirner, and we'll get into this as he writes, the unique, as I'm going to detail with, is Stirner's attempt to point to that which is unspeakable. It is the silence underneath all words, but yet this silence is is very real. It is the touchable. It is the feelable. It is the lived experience from your first person worldview. And this lived experience, this um, this tactile experience comes prior to language for Stirner and is more real than language for Stirner. It's not the case that language is absolutely illusory. Language can be useful, but the question for Stirner is does language rule people's minds? Does logos rule people's minds? Do ideas have people instead of people having ideas? And the question for Stirner is not a simple yes and no, because he sees it as something that can only be determined to the individual. And and these concepts that rule people's minds with an absolute fixity, Stirner calls these ideas, these things, spooks or phantasms. And so through this, Stirner seeks to upend these fixed ideas, seeing them only as phantasms, as apparitions, as ghosts, as spooks, and to see that they're just bats in one's belfry, and to reduce them and trivialize them into products of the mind, perhaps epiphenomena. The point here is that through the unique, Stirner seeks to detail the undetailable, to describe the undescribable, to name the unnameable. And this is the tricky position that Stirner finds himself in, because many of those who are most critical of him take the unique as something that is as a new ideal, as a new form to which people must live up to. However, for Stirner, he only seeks to point towards that which already is. He just one metaphor he uses is that the unique is like your name. There are people who have your same name, but you are not your name. It only, when I call you by your name, it only points to that which you are. It only points to you. And this pointing is, rather than taking language to be something in and of itself, something essential that describes, exhaustively the universe as it is, Stirner sees it as, perhaps, as I'm going to, perhaps, and this is my interpretation here, perhaps seeing it as a tool, as something to be utilized, as something to be appropriated towards one's own ends. The unique, hence, can be seen as something that embraces authenticity, that moves beyond the particular limits, the constraints of identity, and seeks to move towards a life that isn't determined by ideas or concepts, but lives irrespective of them. And these could be great concepts that have violence or force, such as the state or the crown. And without the respect towards these things, great violence can occur. And so the question for Stirner is, I shouldn't say question. For Stirner, this authenticity, this being oneself is paramount, and he sees this, and he sees that many people haven't yet lived because they are possessed by a particular idea, and they are governed by it in some sense, like in a cult-like manner, and don't live for themselves. They don't create their own meaning for themselves. They only are a pawn in another person's game. And so in this sense, Stirner seeks to move towards self-determination of ideas, of things, and of oneself. But I'll stop there, because I do tend to ramble. Pardon me. Pardon me. Oh, here we go. So I think we're on 56. I think we stopped here.
Are you sharing your screen right now?
Am I sharing?
If you are, I don't see it.
I thought I was. No, I guess I'm not. Well, that's good to know. I'll be sharing this right here. Cool. I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. let me know if that's. I hope that works for the recording. Sometimes it's a little funky.
I do see it now, though.
Cool. Yeah. Good. Thanks for reminding me because I was absolutely under the impression that I was sharing my screen. Once again, I'm not very familiar with Zoom, so thanks for pointing that out, Clark.
Yeah, no worries.
Let me go full screen here. Yes. So we left off here, and this is where we're going to begin. For Stirner, there's this metaphor that he has between things, ideas, and a person. And so this is the metaphor of the child, the youth, and the adult, in which the child is ruled by things. And this is kind of a proto psychological account of maturation, in which the child is first ruled or determined by things, and then the youth is then determined by ideas and grows obsessed and engrossed by them, until which the adult, how do I say, towards which the adult moves past these ideas, moves beyond these ideas, just like the child did by moving beyond things through reason and becomes fixed by reason, by ideas. And the adult doesn't wholly reject things nor reason, but moves beyond things and reason or thoughts, towards embracing and seeing oneself as the center of things. No longer are things the center of the world. No longer are ideas such as God, such as capital H history, the center of things. Stirner sees oneself as at the end point of this of this progression here. And this very much goes in hand with his understanding of perhaps individualism, which is very unique. It's very much almost entirely at odds with modern individualism today. The and so this is where moving away from intellectualizing one's feelings, in some sense, Stirner seeks just embracing one's feelings, embracing the silence, to feel one's feelings, to sit with them. In a sense, moving beyond the rational, not into the irrational, but certainly from the rational perspective, it is irrational. I would argue it would be non-rational. It is in the physical, the somatic, the graspable, the material. This would inspire French philosopher Bataille with his understanding of base materialism, since Bataille was critical of Marx's understanding of dialectical materialism.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
So Rick Roderick has what's it called? Videos on Foucault. And I know you were just saying how, rationality is not really the goal. And it reminded me of the concept from Foucault called regimes of truth. So,
I'm not familiar. Please explain.
Regimes of truth, if I remember correctly from the recording, it's sort of like, any knowledge is essentially a power play. And how he gives an example of not any knowledge, but any truth claim. So like, let's say, Rick Roderick had a student, he uses this as an example, and he's like, well, all knowledge is power. And the student says, I don't agree with you. And he's like, well, I'll fail you if you don't agree. And then, the student, of course, it's a joke, but then, he says the student falls in line. And this, demonstration of the power of, behind truth reminds me of the idea that, if Stirner is not about, making some sort of hegemonic rationality to hold above oneself, then it's almost like he's questioning the power of regimes of truth in a way.
You'd be accurate. I very much agree with that. If you look in the uniqueness property, do a control F search function and type in science, this is what Stirner is critical of. I think most cases the word translated would be, oh, what's it? Oh, I'm forgetting the word. I'm forgetting the German word. I think it's Gewissen. Is it Gewissenschaft? Ah, man, I'm forgetting. I don't even know that's right. But the science that Stirner is talking about is this disciplinary science. It's very much in the understanding of the Hegelian science, which is holistic, which seeks to have, and I've said this before, this understanding of all things and their interrelations. In some sense, the Hegelian science is a science which projects itself to have all knowing, which and knows all things. If I've said it enough already, this Stirner sees as, you're right, and him being critical of these regimes of power, he sees rationality as an institutionalization of power, and his critique of reason is, if we're only supposed to act reasonably, if we're only supposed to think reasonably, are we the ones thinking, or is reason thinking for us? The and this is where Stirner finds himself more in line with the pre-Socratics than with Socrates, and more in line with the sophists, because he sees reason as a tool. He sees it as always having been a tool, only except that now we've deified it into something sacred, into something untouchable, into something absolutely immovable and fixed. I very much agree with the understanding of Stirner challenging regimes of power. He has this a very similar argument in his minor essay that I think he also published to the Rheinische Zeitung, called "The False Principle of Our Education." In it, he describes how education. He describes in his own view, the history of education, where education came from, and he details how previously there are two conflicting pedagogical or teaching styles. And one of the pedagogical styles was humanism, which focused on the classics such as the Bible, and was, how do I say, and was meant to mold people into a very type of like Renaissance idealism. The other is this type of pragmatic, more modern understanding. I'm forgetting the term. I wish I could remember. My apologies. In either case, Stirner sees a deficiency in both these education styles, because they still put education as, how do I say, as something that must be done to a person, that must be instilled into a person. For the pragmatic person, education is just a means to an end, and this end is like chattel slavery for him. Once we learn all the things we need to use, we put it to work, and we work until we die. Whereas with the humanist pedagogy, we learn all the classics, and both have a sense of power within them. But yeah, very much so. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else. Um, well, I think it should be good if we move on to our reading. I think this has been an excellent discussion, but I wanted to get to the source text and see how far we go. As I said before, I have to go somewhere in an hour from now, so I'm doing my best to honor our time. So if we don't mind, I will be doing the reading. We'll probably read one page at a time, maybe two. We'll stop when I feel like it's appropriate to stop, but please feel free to interrupt me at any time, or type your thoughts in the comments as I'm reading this. I should have put in the Discord this text if you want to follow along. Give me a second. I can pull out the PDF right now.
You're not ending the meeting right now, are you, Tim?
No. In 1 hour, I will be ending the meeting.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
Here's a link to an online source of it. Give me Give me 1 second, and I can get it pretty close. Get pretty close there. Well, here's a link to it. You'll have to find where we're at right now. I can't link directly to the source, but I put it in the Discord if you need to find that there. That's how you can follow along if you want. But I'll be reading and we'll be stopping in a few minutes from now. So if you allow me, let me zoom in a little bit and we can see how far things go. I'm going to start here. We read this last time, but we're gonna. I think it's important to read this to get a better understanding of where we're coming from. So here we go. Does Feuerbach live in a world other than his own? Does he perhaps live in Hesse's world, in Skelzia's world, in Stirner's world? Since Feuerbach lives in this world, since it surrounds him, isn't it the world that is felt, seen, thought by him that is in a Feuerbachian way? He doesn't just live in the middle of it, but he himself is its middle. He is the center of his world. And like Feuerbach, no one lives in any other world than his own. And like Feuerbach, everyone is the center of his own world. World is only what he himself is not, but what belongs to him. It is a relationship with him, exists for him. Everything turns around you. You are the center of the outer world of the thought world, your inner world. Your world extends as far as your capacity, and what you grasp is your own, simply because you grasp it. You, the unique, are the unique only together with your property, your world. Meanwhile, it doesn't escape you that what is yours is still in itself its own at the same time. That is, it has its own existence. It is the unique, the same as you. At this point, you forget yourself in sweet self-forgetfulness. But when do you forgetfulness? But when you forget yourself, do you then disappear? When you don't think of yourself, have you utterly ceased to exist? When you look in your friend's eye and reflect upon the joy you would like to bring him, when you gaze up at the stars, meditate upon their laws, or perhaps send them a greeting, which they bring to a lonely little room, when you lose yourself in the activity of the infusion of tiny animals under a microscope, when you rush to help someone in danger of burning or drowning without considering the danger of you yourself are risking, then indeed you don't think of yourself. You forget yourself. But do you exist only when you think of yourself? And do you dissipate when you forget yourself? Do you exist only through self-consciousness? Who doesn't forget himself constantly? Who doesn't lose sight of himself thousands of times in an hour? This self-forgetfulness, this losing of oneself is for us only a mode of self-enjoyment. It is only the pleasure we take in our world, in our property, that is world pleasure. It is not in this self-forgetfulness, but in forgetting that the world is our world, that is unselfish, that is duped egoism, that has its basis therein. You throw yourself down before a higher, absolute world and waste yourself. Unselfishness is not self-forgetfulness in the sense of no longer thinking of oneself and no longer being concerned with oneself, but in the other sense of forgetting that the world is ours, of forgetting that one is the center or owner of this world, that it is our property. Fear and timidity towards the world as a higher world is cowardly. Humble egoism, egoism in its slavish form, which doesn't dare to grumble, which secretly creeps about and denies itself. It is self-denial. Our world and the sacred world, herein lies the difference between the straightforward egoism and the self-denying egoism that cannot be confessed and crawls about incognito. What happens with Feuerbach's example of the courtesan and the beloved? Actually, I think we should stop here because He's going to something else. But I think this is a great passage. I really love this. Let me check the chat real quick. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Reading is one of my passions. I would be a professional reader if I could, but doesn't make money, capitalism, all that. I think this is an important part for Stirner. I think this self-forgetfulness is, and this critique of self-consciousness is also at the center of it. We should understand that these very proto-Marxist ideas were occurring, in which, especially for Bruno Bauer, we must come to a sense of self-consciousness in order for us to be able to self-determine us. We have to know what we are in order for us to do that which we are able to do. This is what we have an understanding of, for example, in Marx, this understanding of understanding that and having the understanding that, how do I say, having the self-consciousness that we are the proletariat. And it is through this self-consciousness that we can overthrow the means of production from the capitalists. I don't say that in critique, but this is an example. And so Stirner here is critical of the self-consciousness, and I would argue it is not wholesale critique of this consciousness. It is because it is insufficient. Stirner doesn't place the highest value in self-consciousness, in this understanding of one's self-identity. And in some cases, it could be argued that he does have this too, where he speaks of having this understanding of oneself as oneself to be that self-consciousness. In either case, he sees these self-consciousness, these aims for self-consciousnesses to be alienating. That we have to seek to become human, that we have to live up to the concept of human, always measuring ourselves up against it. For Stirner, this type of self-forgetfulness, this living irrespective of the concept, is a very radical act, because it means, one, you don't even treat it as something that is worthy of critique. You don't even treat it as something that needs to be fought. You live irrespective of it, and it is, and to use a phrase, it is beneath you. And this moment of self-enjoyment, this moment of pleasure, Stirner sees in the moments where we forget ourselves, where we lose ourselves. And I think an example he gives is when we're eating with friends, when we have, after a long day, relax and enjoy ourselves, do something for the sake of it and ourselves, not for some higher utility, not for some grand plan, but when we consume for our sake, when we negate things and determine things for ourselves. And he sees this movement, this movement as selfish, and sees this not as a negative, because he sees in people who are slaving away and who are living in the ideologies that bind them to their slavery, the potential to be something more. And this potential to be something more comes from greed, comes from selfishness, comes from a desire to make one's world better, to make oneself, to be happier with oneself, to arrange one's world in a way that brings oneself pleasure. And this is where Stirner, we can see in him this high critique of idealism, or he sees within Bruno Bauer, and this is also directed towards Moses Hess, for example, where Moses Hess accuses Stirner as embracing animality, as pure, how do I say, as not even consciousness, as pure, how do I say, like immediacy. But Stirner is seeking to move beyond this. It's not regressive in his mind, as I would argue. It's moving beyond. This self-forgetfulness, this losing of oneself, is for us only a mode of self-enjoyment. It is only the pleasure we take in our world, in our property, that is world pleasure. And he is saying that by forgetting it, that the world is our world, that the world is for us, that that we have a stake in it, that we have a claim in it, that we have something to say and do for the world for our sake, rather than leaving it alone and leaving it to some higher power, some strong man, messiah figure to come down and transcend from the echelons of the pantheons of high society or whatever. Here we can see in Stirner this advocacy for the timid, for the shy, to embrace authenticity, to embrace being themselves unapologetically. This authenticity that is irrespective of the forms of power that shame, that ridicule, that judge and bring violence because of this judgment. Our world and the sacred world, herein lies the difference between the straightforward egoism and the self-denying egoism that cannot be confessed and crawls about incognito. And so in this, we can possibly see that, and as Stirner would write in his book, this understanding that the world is ours, that it is that we have a stake in it, that we have a claim to it, means that we can do with it and arrange it for our benefit. And if things don't benefit us, if the arrangements don't work for us, Stirner, as he has written in the Uniqueness Property, this means, we can, for example, no longer be arranged, but seek to arrange ourselves. Rather than having the capitalists owning the means of production and having that arrange us, having that determine us and what we can do, the kinds of things that, and the world that we live in, we can move beyond that, undo that, negate it, and seek to bring about our own arrangements, not to install a new set of arrangements, to make better arrangements, to install, to get away with the old king, the old terrible king, and put in a new, better king, to do away with the king entirely, to do away with the universalizing projects that how do I say, that's I'm forgetting adjectives here, that squash people's independent aspirations that are higher, that are loftier than the general. And this comes with great trepidity from the socialists, because with this means that in Stirner's embrace of, how do I say, I'm going to argue that Stirner, as opposed to many of the socialists of his day, the socialists would argue for a universalizing project, much like Feuerbach. Feuerbach would have this universal concept of the human and seek to create a new religion that is universal. And Stirner, on the other hand, rather than emphasizing the most universal or the totalizing, he would emphasize perhaps the most particular, and as I would argue, the most singular. As he writes here, what does he say? He speaks of the unique not just in terms of individuals, but also in terms of the world of things. I'm forgetting where he writes this. Pardon me. I'm really blinking where he said this. I'm gonna move on. I wish I could show it.
There is one thing that I wanted to comment on.
Oh, please. Oh, sorry. I found it. I'm gonna interrupt you right here. Don't. So he says that there is an independent existence of things. It doesn't escape you that what is yours is still itself, its own at the same time. That is, it has its own existence. This thing is unique, the same as you. At this point, you forget yourself in sweet forgetfulness. He sees the joining of things and persons, the uniting and the consuming of things and ideas, and and perhaps better said, the negating of these ideas and things in their determination as sweet forgetfulness, as a pleasurable activity, as one has a beer at the end of a long day. This self-forgetfulness is something he sees in the uniting of the the singularities of both oneself, the inexpressible, the thing that is beyond language, and what we would call beer, but this beer that is for us in this very moment. It may be called a beer, it may be, but at the same time, it is wholly unique, and that's kind of what I see there. Go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
One thing that sticks out to me a lot here that I think is useful for a constructivist view of Stirner is your world extends as far as your capacity, and what you grasp is your own simply because you grasp it. So I don't know if Stirner is necessarily a constructivist, but I mean, I tend to read him as one, make Stirner my own, so to speak. So the idea that your world extends as far as your capacity, it's like whatever we interpret as the bottle in front of us, can be our own unique interpretation. And people might say, well, you didn't construct the bottle in front of you, you didn't make it appear, it's there, separate from you. But insofar as one understands the bottle and one takes a conceptual world and applies it to the bottle in which they experience, then whatever sort of is in your capacity for understanding the bottle is also your own unique creation of the bottle, insofar as it extends into your capacity. What do you think about that?
Well, I think a constructivist perspective on Stirner, and to be clear, I perhaps it's probably good to define what constructivism is. It's the sense that, if I'm correct, it's constructivism as very much in line with like social constructivism, that like the concepts that we use are constructed via language or via like symbology. Is that what you mean by constructivism?
Yeah, I do mean something in that vein, although he says the creative nothing creates the world. So we are the creative nothing, and so if the creative nothing creates the world, then we create the world. But is the creative nothing, the creative nothing is creating the world, but it's not us, then that would mean that the creative nothing is something separate from us and above us. So I assume that the creative nothing which creates the world is us.
That's that is, I tend to interpret the creative nothing as like one's consciousness, or perhaps like oneself, which perhaps could be that's even trickier. The I would agree, yes, that Stringer does align the creative nothing, perhaps with oneself, with one's identity. But identity isn't a good word here because identity comes from the Latin word identitas, or identical. It means that which is like like in itself, as itself. Um, and so when we say something is identical, it is identical with itself or identical with something else. The As for what the creative nothing is, the creative nothingness, as I read it, and keep in mind, this is a book that has a variety, that has and had a variety of interpretations, even when it was first published. The way I interpret the creative nothing is the thing that is prior to language. It But it is the experiencer, um, and it is from this creative nothing, and it seems to be like this ontological and like psychological thing at the same time too. So it's the creative nothing is a thing that unites concepts, that that generates itself. In some sense, it's like a tabula rasa, in which there is nothing, because the slate is blank, because the painting is blank, enables us to paint over it, to paint on it however we want. I tend to get that idea, but I don't think Stirner's arguing for like a biological understanding of tabula rasa. It's more of an understanding of consciousness. But then at the same time, I'm going to argue that there is this kind of ontological understanding of how the creative nothing is in some sense before being, that it isn't self-identical with being, but it is what constitutes being. That it is not an absence. It is like this positively charged void, and because there is nothing, it enables there to be something. And this is how like we can read it possibly ontologically, and this is also where we can see a jab at Feuerbach. Feuerbach was highly against an understanding of the universe coming ex nihilo, and if Stirner posits ontologically that there was nothing before being, that means nothing comes before something. I believe Feuerbach's position was that the world, that being has always existed, but Stirner is unique because he posits that the universe came from nothing, and this is because Feuerbach wants to argue that basically like a creator, that there's a god, not in a perhaps not in a theistic way, but as like an absolute kind of atheistic god, like the god of nature. Stirner wants to deny this, however, at least in my opinion. This is one way you can read Stirner.
I tend to read Stirner, I guess in my own way, which of course no one has to follow but me, and I don't even have to follow it. So like when I read Stirner, I tend to like to look at just the negation of the human, the negation of fixed gender. I think Stirner is very useful to me as someone who, doesn't identify as any gender and is, agender. So Stirner in that regard, the refusal of taking on attributes as opposed to just, what is an attribute that I take on for myself, is I also think an aspect of ownness which can be useful from Stirner.
And that does remind me that this sense of a creative nothing also implies, like, has something to say about these attributes. That because there are no attributes, because there's an absence or a void of attributes, this enables a person to be able to take on any attributes, to do away with any attributes, or to have no attributes. I think Birch was saying something about this in the Discord chat, where Stirner doesn't seek, the closest understanding of self-identity that Stirner has is that I am I. However, this, or perhaps better said, I am blank, I am nothing. And this nothingness is what enables him to take on any attribute, any grammatical predicate, to seek oneself in, to seek to move beyond, and to not see one wholly exhausted by a particular concept. Because this is where Stirner, as I would argue, takes a type of, and once again, this is very much my reading, but I do think it's in line with Jacob Blumenfeld's book, the Unique Philosophy of Max Stirner, where he writes that Stirner can be seen as an ethical thinker in a Spinozian sense, in which Stirner doesn't posit like more deontological morals that one ought to live up to, but rather he points out a way, a method, or a way one can orient oneself towards living. And this is where I see in Stirner an ethical project, because Stirner describes how the self does not have any fixed grammatical predicate, does not have any fixed identity, because as he's going to point towards language, I am blank. I am at most identical to myself. And this means this is where I see the singularity, that I am myself is this tautological self-recursion. And it's very similar to the apophatic theology, this negative theology, where God defines himself through himself. I am that I am. And because of this, many Christian theologians would understand God to have any and all possible attributes, which enables him to be actus purus, pure actuality, rather than having any higher potentiality that one must live up to, otherwise known as what's it called? Crap, purest potence, pure potentiality. I'm losing my train of thought now. Crap. Where was I? Could I get a reminder?
Yeah, we were talking about the creative nothing. We were talking about constructivism versus, I as I, not versus I as I, but you were talking about the I as I. And then you started talking about something else, which I just
Yes,
yeah.
the ethical project of Stirner. And so because he leaves there and the subject, the grammatical subject, as having an openness to being able to take upon or remove grammatical predicates, attributes, properties. This enables for self-determination. And this is why I call it Stirner pointing towards a singularity that is inexpressible. It's not that there's a monad, it's that there are multiple singularities. But perhaps that's a wrong terminology. That's just the best concept that I have to point towards what Stirner has here. Because as I said before, I don't think it lines with his understanding of particularity. And I think we've had this discussion before where it's like pure difference or difference as difference. The point is that the ethical project that I see in Stirner is one that seeks to move beyond the particular labels or categories that we might see in ourselves and in others, and to be open, to be how do I say, receptive to the difference in oneself that perhaps contradicts a particular universal concept that one might seek to scrupulously and neurotically live up to. It leaves a space towards how to say, acceptance for oneself, self-acceptance, but it also leaves in some sense leaving open a space for others to understand that others aren't wholly defined by the categories that we may see them as or that they may see themselves as, and offers the potential to see others as others and to love others as the other that they are, not to love a person because they fit within a particular category, because you are human, I love you as humanly, but to love you in the way that you need and ought to be loved, to love me in the way that I ought to love myself. And I perhaps shouldn't be using ought here. Stirner doesn't leave this into some moral deontological perspective. He doesn't say you even have to do this, but I think him detailing this and deconstructing the type of ideology or the identities that people may take upon or see within others offers us to deconstruct these identities and to have a radical embrace of otherness, not only within ourselves but within the other. That is what I see as an ethical project, and Jacob Blumenfeld writes a lot better than I. But this might also just because my first introduction to philosophy was Levinas, an ethical thinker, who is, interestingly enough, kind of the opposite of Stirner. I've said this before, but the point is, I think that the key difference between Levinas and Stirner is that Stirner begins with the self, and his love of the self overflows from himself to others, whereas from Levinas, it begins with the other. We understand that the other is other from, and through loving others, we love ourselves. The metaphor I give is that if you have a glass in a sink, Stirner fills the glass, you are that glass, and the glass overflows and fills the sink, which is the other. Levinas does the opposite. He fills the sink, and then the sink overflows into the cup. But that's kind of the end of my thought. Any points that anyone feels like they want to bring up, or anything that you think are that we should bring up? Any questions? Any even side tangents? I do appreciate side tangents.
I might save my thoughts, but I mean, I could use it now.
Oh, for sure. I might rein us in, but That's always a given. But yeah, go ahead. Let's go ahead.
So I was, trying to reconcile Stirner with the science of logic. And, one of the things that I think Stirner doesn't care about is the concept or the absolute. He kind of says at the end of The Ego in Its Own that he cares about his own history. And if he's not caring about the transhistorical sort of concept, which of course has the categories of like universal, individual, in particular, that are sort of the ground of history, then, without this ground of the absolutes, Stirner and what he's talking about, is there ever like, is any individuality ever anything other than illusory? Like if there is no if being and if essence is the sort of step between being and the concept, and you get rid of the concept, then you essentially don't have any, essence doesn't lead anywhere. Essence leads to no stability. So in what sense is there ever, a stable identity in the difference of being if the absolute is totally negated?
I think, and in some sense, my response would be to say that Stirner. I'm going to put this first. Stirner is very much a paradoxical thinker, even more paradoxical than Hegel, perhaps. That is a contentious statement. However, I think the question is, how can we have a stable identity in this instability where Stirner rejects concepts? Arguably, he also rejects essence. He also rejects being, arguably. This is where I think Stirner's, and so how can we have a stable identity? How can we even say there is this I? I think Stirner's answer to say that there isn't. Or if anything, the stability is its instability. And this is where he's critical of Fichte, for example. Fichte puts up for this absolute I, the I, the unchanging I beneath all things. It's like the eye of God. It is the subject that God is beneath all things. It is foundational, and this I is the eye of God, because God is conscious. Everything has the potential for consciousness, including us, and so on. I think it does a very similar thing with Feuerbach, where he says, because there is this I, the I, this absolute I. Sorry, I should say the absolute I. It is never this, because this indicates particularity. So for Fichte, the absolute I is also comes with prescriptive and moral claims about how people ought to act. It all comes from this understanding of being. And you have the human being, the species essence, that all seeks to constrict and confine and encompass particularities, and this is what I'm arguing what Stirner thinks. Stirner sees these universal, as I'm going to argue. Stirner sees, as I'm going to argue, that these essences, that these concepts, that even being comes with prescriptive claims and normativizing claims about how people ought to be. Otherwise, about how people ought to be, how a person ought to act as a human being. And this is where Stirner, in opposition to the absolute I that Fichte puts forward, or the Genusswesen, the species being, the genus essence of humanity, which Stirner absolutely opposes. And it's not that he out, in some sense, he doesn't deny that people see these things, that people see these universal concepts and things. He denies their absolutivity, their absolute universality, and instead points towards the unique I, the transient I, the never, how do I say that, the ever-changing I. He says it is this I, my I. This is where I see Stirner here. This is where even to invoke my I in a sentence, like for example, I am blank in a particular identity, this this transience, this ever changing, does it even means that the I isn't stable. That but I think the response is to say that this instability is its stability. That this that pure difference, that difference as difference, um, its self-identity is its non-identity, or its unity is its disunity. And I think this is where Stirner can also be seen to have parallels with the absolute. He sees, I see Stirner like his weapon against the absolute. I read as the unique. I think last week we read that Stirner sees the unique as being able to kill logic with logos, language, ideas, and the very foundation of Hegel's thought, with with the unique. And this is where I see the unique as being an absolute conflict with the absolute, or perhaps not said conflict, because that still implies that it's still participating in the dialectic that utilizes conflict. It's like a narcissist that it will always weaponize anything you throw at him and use it towards its own means and ends. This is where I see the unique as this type of opting out. This thing. If I don't say if the absolute is everything, if I am included within this concept, then how do I say? Then I can take it as myself and no longer seek to live up to it, or if I'm outside of it, then it's not absolute. And this tends to be a thing that Stirner mentions consistently throughout the unique and its property. Does that align with perhaps more modern understandings of and Hegelian readings? In fact, there's certainly conflict and tension, but that's at least what Stirner thinks and says. Yeah, thank you, John. Perhaps I'm a little late to that. Does that make sense?
I think so. I guess, my usage of Stirner is probably more like what people criticize Stirner for, like the negation aspect. Like if there really is no stable identity and the stability is the instability, then, I would just sort of get rid of the identity part, because it seems like the identity, it's not extended in space. Like Stirner says, no idea exists, for it is not empirical. And if that's, for me, I'm just kind of like, why not just stop there? It's like, okay, no identity exists. Now I can just exist without any sort of like, attribute that I need to conform to.
That is a good question. But this is because I see Stirner as not doing away with spirit, but rather utilizing spirit, not doing away with logos, but utilizing it. This is where I think Stirner lends himself to like Pyrrhonist, what's it called, quietude. But the question is like, why do you say anything? Like why do you still operate within language? This is where I see Stirner as the as how do I say it, on the limits of discourse, and where he's still. This is where, yeah, that is a great question. Like, why doesn't he just like just move on? Why does he even bother to embrace any form of identity? Why to say no identity? I think Stirner leaves it open, to be honest. But I don't see him explicitly putting forward the project that we should do away with all identity. But I do think that is a common reading. However, I would argue against it. There's this particular quote in The Unique in Its Property where Stirner writes that of the spirit and says, like, spirit is not wholly something to be rejected, and but it is something to be used. It is something for oneself. And I see this understanding of forwardness also within the understanding of the absolute. that the absolute is not separate from me, but it is for me. It is I am not barred from it. I am it. And if I understand myself as it and it as I, then then why live up to any type of absolute morality, any type of higher and seek to live up to higher concepts that I must seek to live out. I also, and this is where we get into the understanding that sometimes, like, some people read Stirner as saying that we should just just wholesale embrace everything that we love about ourselves, and he does wholly accept himself as himself. But this, some people read as coming at the rejection of any progression, at the rejection of anything anything new, and some read it as Nietzschean's last man, where it's absolute stability, absolute comfort with no conflict, with no progression, with no moving forward. This is where I rather read Stirner as one who moves forward, as someone, as I use, vibing forward. We're not going somewhere because we must go somewhere. I am where I am meant to be. If my destination is myself, I have nowhere that I must be, but I am home and with myself at all times. But that doesn't prevent me from being here or there. Nor does it prevent me from moving and embracing change. But yeah.
Well, I guess, in certain ways, I think one could take a stance that, in this particular way, I am nothing, but in this other particular way, I am, one who contains interpretations of things. And so insofar as one utilizes their interpretations, they are utilizing spirit. I mean, that's essentially what it is to, like, interpret the law, or to engage with someone socially, is like you're sort of building upon all this stuff, which might be illusory in terms of whether or not it has any existence in the world. It's ideas, but at the same time, ideas are still useful. So I don't know if I would go all the way to, like, it's that there is no such thing as nothing. I think that nothingness can be taken upon as one of the aspects of what do I identify with or not identify with.
Yeah, and I think that's closer to what Stirner has to say. I don't think Stirner puts forward the ideal that we must live in a spookless world, because I think he rightly defines that a spook is whatever subjugates you, and so one's fixed idea of one's identity is another person's, like heaven or hell, or another fixed identity. So it's a matter of a personal judgment of what determines you. And I mean, that's kind of all that you have. You only have the cards that you have. You only have the cards that you can work with. However, I don't think Stirner outwardly denies identity or the forming of spirit. He's going to use an example against Feuerbach. Feuerbach accuses him for being, for Stirner rejecting concepts, and it says, well, aren't you a male? Don't you think in a male way? and calls Stirner basically emasculate, and his wife a gorilla, I think. I said this before, but the reviews are absolutely hilarious, especially coming from the 19th century. They're just throwing shade. But I do think if we read forward, we can have some greater insight to these questions that you're asking now, Ben. Is there any other questions that we have that we want to bring up before we move into our reading? I will have to go in 20 minutes, so just keep that in mind.
I'm good.
Yeah.
I have a kind of a small request.
Oh, please.
Tim, when I go to a meeting, I really it would be a treat to just be able to see who the host is and what they look like as I'm listening to them, and imagine what you look. Would you mind using your camera for just a couple of seconds to see?
Just one idea.
Yeah, so I just know who's speaking.
Give me a second. I'm in a dark room, so let me bring in some light so I actually look somewhat decent.
Is this the Timothy face reveal?
Yeah. I don't know if any of you have gone to other meetings with me. I go to a lot of meetings, and I I just just want to see what the host looks like, so I can sort of picture who they are as they're speaking and as I'm listening to them.
Well, I've been attending Timothy's meetings for like over 2 years now, so this will be a real treat.
Oh, is that right? Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know. Oh, hi, Timothy. Hold on. I can't use my video because it says that you cannot start a video because the host has stopped it. Does that mean, I don't know what that, I click on my video and nothing happens. Thank you, Tim.
No, I just do that for privacy reasons. Especially since we're recording this meeting, I think things can go wrong, especially with video cameras, and
Oh, say, okay.
and that's also just for the sake of the.
So, Tim, have you been doing this meeting for quite a while? And
Yes.
oh, I don't know. Yeah, I think I thought this meeting was on Discord, and I just have not dare try and deal with the technical issues of Discord. And I think that's another reason why I have not done your meeting before. But for some reason it worked this time. I got the link, and so I will try and join your meeting in the future.
Wonderful. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I tend not to show my face because they're just weird people online, and I tend to respect my privacy. So it's for me, it's for you, it's for all of us, and I tend to like.
And I think one of the reasons I'm a face person is because I'm an actress, and
Oh, wonderful.
I'm used to, I don't know, I just like when I go see a play on stage, for example, I like to sit in the front of the theater so I can see the actor's expression and how they emote. And so I think that's where it just my love of faces and wanting to see the face of
I understand that.
people. I think that's where it comes from. Yeah.
I understand that. I will be continuing our reading. Yeah, I appreciate that. All right, let me. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to bring up? Any requests? Anything else? Well, I'll be continuing the reading then, and we'll see how Stirner responds to de Feuerbach here. And I paused here because Feuerbach gives an example of a courtesan, basically a very wealthy person, who has a mistress and a beloved, a wife. And the Feuerbach says that, basically in arguing against egoism, that to do the right thing is to sacrifice the lower thing to the higher thing. And egoism is all about embracing the lower thing. It's just wanton sinfulness. And this is rich coming from an atheist, as Stirner will write. And so this division between the higher and lower is also something that Stirner will be critical against. And so we will see how Stirner responds to Feuerbach's accusation here. He's also implying that Stirner is like destitute, poor, and that the only reason that he married his wife was because she was a mistress. So if you read the review here, it's just a like personal attack after personal attack, and it's hilarious, as I said before. But we'll see how things pan out. So here we go. What happens with Feuerbach's example of the courtesan and the beloved? In the first case, one has a commercial relationship without personal interest, and it doesn't happen in countless others. Completely different cases of commercial relationships that one can only be satisfied if one has an interest in the person with whom one deals. If one has a personal interest, in the second case, one has a personal interest. So commercial interest with the mistress, personal interest in the wife, the beloved. Most likely, but what is the meaning of the second relationship? The beloved, I believe. Most likely, mutual interest with this person. If this interest between the people disappears from the relationship, it would become meaningless because this interest is its only meaning. So what is marriage, which is praised as a sacred relationship, as Feuerbach does, if not the fixation of an interesting relationship, despite the danger that it can become dull and meaningless? People say that one shouldn't get divorced frivolously, as Feuerbach does. But why not? Because frivolity is a quote unquote sin if it concerns a sacred thing. There must be no frivolity. So then there is an egoist who is cheated out of his frivolity and condemns himself to go on living in uninterestingly but sacred relationships. From the egoist association, a sacred bond has developed. The mutual interest the people had for each other ceases, but the bond remains, but the bond without interest remains. Another example of the uninteresting is work, which passes from one's life work for the human calling. This is the origin of the prejudice that one has to earn his bread and that it is shameful to have bread without having worked a bit to get it. This is the pride of the wage. Work has no merit in itself and does no honor to anyone, just as the life of the idler brings him no disgrace. Either you take an interest in work activity and this interest doesn't let you rest, or, you have to be active. Pardon me. And then work is your desire, your special pleasure, without placing it up above the laziness of the idler, which is his pleasure. Or you use work to pursue another interest, a result, or a wage, and you submit to work only as a means to this end. And then work is not interesting in itself and has no pretension of being so. And you can recognize that it is not anything valuable or sacred in itself, but simply something that is now unavoidable for gaining the desired result, the wage. But the work that is considered as an honor for the human being and as his quote unquote calling has become the curator of economics and remains the mistress of sacred socialism, where in its quality as human labor, it is supposed to develop human capacities, where this development is a human calling, an absolute interest. Paren. We will have more to say about this further on. And paren. The belief that something other than self-interest might justify applying oneself to a given thing, the belief that leaves self-interest behind generates a lack of interest, sin, understood as a tendency as towards one's own interest. Only in the face of sacred interest does one's own interest become private interest, abominable egoism, sin. Stirner points out the difference between sacred interest and one's own interest briefly on page 244, I think in the German copy of the Uniqueness Property. I can sin against the former, the sacred, but the latter I can throw away, one's own interest. Sacred interest is the uninteresting because it is an absolute interest or an interest for its own sake. And it's all the same whether you take an interest in it or not. You are supposed to make it your interest. It is not originally yours. It doesn't spring from you, but it is an eternal, universal, purely human interest. It is uninteresting because there is no consideration in it for you or your interests. It is an interest without interested parties because it is a universal or human interest and because you are not its owner, but are supposed to become its follower and servant. Egoism comes to an end before it, and lack of interest begins. If you take just one sacred interest to heart, you'll be caught and duped about your own interests. Call the interest that you follow now sacred, and tomorrow you'll be its slave. All behavior towards anything considered absolutely interesting or valuable in and for itself is religious behavior, or more simply, religion. The interesting can only be interesting through your interesting. The valuable can only have value insofar as you give it value. Whereas on the other hand, what is interesting despite you is an uninteresting thing. What is valuable despite you is a valueless thing. The interest of those spirits like that of society, of the human being, of the human essence, of the people as a whole, their quote unquote essential interest is an alien interest and should be your interest. The interest of the beloved is your interest and is the interest to you only so long as it remains your interest. Only when it stops being an interest of yours can it become a sacred interest, which should be yours, although it is not yours. The relationship that was interesting up to that point now becomes a disinterested and uninteresting relationship. In commercial and personal relationships, your interest comes first, and all sacrifices happen only to benefit this interest of yours. While on the contrary, in religious relationship, the religious interest of the absolute or of the spirit, that is, the interest alien to you, comes first. And you should sacrifice your interest to this sacred interest. I'm going to read one more page, sorry. But I think this is getting to the end of his point. Therefore, duped egoism consists in the belief in an absolute interest, which does not spring from the egoist. That is, it is not interesting to him, but rather arises imperiously and firmly against him, an eternal interest. Here, the egoist is duped because his own interest, his private interest, is not only left unconsidered, but even condemned, and yet egoism remains because he welcomes this alien or absolute interest only in the hope that it will grant him some pleasure. This absolute interest, which is supposed to be interesting without interested persons, and which is also therefore not the unique thing, but for which instead of human beings are supposed to view themselves as vessels of honor and as weapons and tools. Stirner calls simply this the sacred. Indeed, the sacred is absolutely uninteresting because it has the pretension of being interesting even though no one is interested in it. It is also the universal, the thing of interest that lacks a subject because it is not one's own interest, the interest of a unique. In other words, this universal interest is more than you, a higher thing. It is also without you. It is absolute. It is an interest for itself, alien to you. It demands that you serve it and find you willing if you let yourself be beguiled. To stay with Feuerbach's touching definition on the courtesan, there are those who would gladly be lewd because physical desire never gives them rest. But they are told, do you know what lewdness is? It is a sin, a vulgarity, a vulgarity. It defiles us. If they were to say, we don't want lewd interests to cause us to neglect other interests that are even more important to us than the enjoyment of the senses, this would not be a religious consideration. And they would make their sacrifice not to chastity, but to other benefits of which they cannot deprive themselves. But if instead they deny their natural impulse for the sake of chastity, this occurs due to religious considerations. What interest do they have in chastity? Unquestionably, no natural interest, because their nature advises them to be lewd. Their actual, unmistakable, and undeniable interest is lewdness. But chastity is a scruple of their spirit, because it is an interest of the spirit, a spiritual interest. It is an absolute interest before which natural and private interest must remain silent, and which makes the spirit scrupulous. Now some throw off this scruple with a jerk and cry, how stupid! Because however scrupulous or religious they may be, here an instinct tells them that the spirit is a gouchy despot opposed to natural desire, whereas others overcome this scruple by thinking more deeply and even reassure themselves theoretically. The former overcomes the scruples. The latter, thanks to their virtuosity of thinking, which makes thinking a need and a thing of interest for them, and dissolve the scruple. Thus, lewdness and the courtesan only look so bad because they offend the eternal interest of chastity. So this is a very long argument, and I got 5 minutes, so I'm gonna do my best to provide an exegesis of this, at least according to my interpretation. I'll let the meeting go on. I think I'll assign someone to host it for me. That'll probably be you, Glaga, if that's okay with you. Let me know in the chat if that's not the case. But this metaphor of the courtesan's mistress and wife, Stirner, we can find critical. He applies this metaphor towards socialism, towards economics, but he also applies this towards he also uses this to deconstruct the understanding of why chastity or even marriage is considered to be something sacred, as Feuerbach does. He sees marriage and chastity as an absolute good. He's an atheist, but and upholding morality. So, but and so this is where Stirner. I think the key point we can take from Stirner is that an absolute interest is something that is absolutely uninteresting to absolutely everyone. It is the most universal interest, the most general, and no one has a personal, individual stake in the game. It is something that they are called because they are recognized as resembling or corresponding to this very concept of the human being and so on. This Stirner is going to move on, but he calls sacred socialism, where it deifies and fetishizes human labor as I think he calls it the mistress. The work that is considered an honor for a human being and his calling has become the creator of economics and remains the mistress of sacred socialism. It is he's calling it the lower thing. That sacred socialism, which is and Stirner often correlates sacred with the most universal, the absolute socialism, the universalizing socialism. He sees the fetishization of work as remaining the mistress. The honor of the human being and his calling has become the creator of economics. And it is supposed to develop human capacities, and it is deemed as a good quality, that is human labor. We're supposed to have an absolute interest in labor. Stirner is like, I don't want to work. Your vision is where everyone would be able to work and have no bosses, but I don't want to work, and I don't want any bosses either. Stirner is very much anti-work. And then we have this understanding that only in the face of sacred interest does one's own interest become private, abominable egoism, or sin. Stirner defines the former, sacred, as something that you can sin against. The latter is something that you can throw away. And this goes to a very, I think, Roman concept, Roman understanding of property rights, in which that which is your property is that which you're able to do away with, to negate, to consume, to do as one pleases with it. If you can't do that, then you can't consider it yours, because then someone else either owns it or it is not yours because you do not have control over it. You do not determine it. You do not possess or hold on to it. In a very, phenomenological, you do not, how do I say, possess it in your hands. And so all behavior towards anything considered absolutely interesting is religious behavior or religion. But he points out that the interesting can only be interesting through your interest. This is where Stirner points out that it is us, it is myself that upholds particular forms of ideology, particular institutions, and through our continual, not just ideological support of them, but our material support of them too. The valuable can have only value insofar as you give it value. This is where Stirner points out in some sense, not the moral responsibility, but the responsibility that one has in one's circumstances for oneself, that we can treat things valuable, that things aren't absolutely valuable in and of themselves, but we can treat them as valuable for us because they matter to us. And universal equivalent, such as money, be damned, I value this thing, and it is valued to me regardless of money. It is a general or restricted economy that only operates in terms of signifiers. Stirner seeks to embrace the significationless. Perhaps that's the wrong way. That which cannot be signified. Either case, Stirner points out that essences and concepts as a whole, essential interests which demand fealty that one ought to have interest in, is an alien interest that alienates oneself. Anything that is outside oneself as oneself is an alien interest. The interest of the beloved is your interest until it is not. And this is why, what is a spook? A spook is something that you live, that an ideology that you keep up and put yourself under in order to maintain. The interest of the beloved is your interest and remains your interest only until it does not. And so if one was to continue living that relationship, to use an existentialist term, we could say that they're living in bad faith. And that they're being spooked in some sense, that they and this is why as I would argue that we can't understand spookness as one being spooked is not this universal category that every particular thing is spooked. Nor should we live in a wholly spookless world, because like what one deems as something that fixes oneself is a wholly relative subject and can only be answered by the criteria of oneself. And so if one was to put up with this relationship with the beloved because the courtesan did not love her anymore, why would he continue that relationship? That's living inauthentically. And so this is where Stirner embraces not upholding the bond that is done through language, the marriage bond, but loving how to say, beyond this language bond, and not necessarily, and this is where he gets into the understanding of lewdness, that if a person doesn't subscribe to the understanding of lewdness, and doesn't sacrifice, how do I say, and has no understanding of a higher or lower that one sacrifices to, that one follows oneself and how one feels about something, rather than thinking about something and coming to a moral calculus to how one ought to behave. It's this type of emotional self-expression that one loves as one loves, and Stirner is going to allow himself to love as he feels this love. And he's going to do this without scruple, without question of sin, unquestionably no natural interest, because their nature advises them to be lewd, and calls chastity a scruple, and those which make it, I would say, and those which make private personal interest silent, and which makes the spirit scrupulous. And so one can read Stirner as saying, throw off this scruple with a jerk and a cry and say, how stupid, trivialize it, nominalize it. However, the religious and the scrupulous will seek to, as I say, come to a moral calculus and how one ought to determine like one's level of goodness and wrongness in respect to this particular thing. This is how I would characterize Stirner as non-rational. It's not necessary. Yeah, I've explained it before, but I have to go. I'm going to stop the stream here because I think that's all we can do for now. So let me